another video for you. I'm going to read another chapter from that book in just a moment. Sorry. All right, let's get started. So, chapter 2 of the Etiquette book. Introductions. The most ceremonious introduction possible is Mrs. Distinguished. May I present Mr. Traveler, or Mrs. Young. May I present Professor Gray. The word present is more formal than the word introduce, but the word introduce is equally proper. The younger person is always introduced to the older, or more distinguished, but a gentleman is always presented to a lady. Even though he is an old gentleman of great distinction and the lady a mere slip of a girl, no woman is ever presented to a man except to the President of the United States, a royal personage, or a dignitary of the church. The correct introduction of either a man or a woman is to the President. Mr. President, I have the honor to present Mrs. Jones, or, if officially, Mrs. Jones of Chicago. Mrs. Jones bows deeply. If the President offers his hand, Mrs. Jones gives him hers. To a reigning sovereign, much formality of presenting names on lists is gone through beforehand, and the actual presentation and accepted name is repeated from one functionary to another, and nothing is said to the king or queen except Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Jones bows, and if the king offers to shake hands, Mrs. Jones bows again deeply as she gives him her hand. To a cardinal, Your Eminence, may I present Mrs. Jones. A non-Catholic behaves exactly as to a king, but a Roman Catholic drops on the right knee, places the right hand palm down under the cardinal's extended hand, and kisses the cardinal's ring. A woman is always presented to archbishops and monsignori, and it is not incorrect to present her to a priest. A woman is always presented to any member of a reigning family. Sorry about that. Oops. Your Royal Highness, or whatever the title, may I present Mrs. Jones, but a foreign ambassador is presented. Your Excellency, may I present you to Mrs. Jones, or Mrs. Jones, may I present His Excellency the British ambassador. An introduction to an archbishop is, Your Grace, may I present Mrs. Jones. But to those who know him socially, a duke is never His Grace, nor a lord, His Lordship. A hostess says, Mrs. Jones, may I present the Duke of over there, or Lord Blank. The Honorable is merely Mr. Lordson, or Mr. Holdoffice. A doctor, a judge, a bishop are addressed and introduced by their titles. The Protestant clergy are usually Mr. unless they hold the title of doctor or dean or canon, in which case the surname is added. Dean Wood, Dr. Starr. introduced as Senator Davis, whether he is still in office or not. But the President of the United States, once he is out of office, is merely Mr. and not ex-president. An ex-governor and an ex-ambassador are both actually the Honorable, but usually one would in courtesy introduce the latter as ex-ambassador, and the former as ex-governor. An important occasion one would present the Honorable Alfred E. Smith, ex-governor of the state of New York. Unless the occasion is really formal, unless, let us say, you are a chairman introducing a speaker or a hostess presenting people to a guest of honor, the formal introduction is not often used. The typical guest of honor, the formal introductions, the typical introduction suitable not only on informal occasions, but whenever two individuals are introduced, is the mere pronouncing of two names, Mrs. Worldly, Mrs. Norman. If the two names are said in the same tone of voice, it is not apparent who is introduced to whom, but by accentuating the more important person's name, it can be made as clear as though the words "may I present" had been used. More important name is said with a slightly rising inflection. The secondary has a mere statement of fact. For instance, suppose you say, "Are you there?" and then, "It is raining." Use the same inflection exactly and say, "Mrs. Worldly, Mrs. Younger." A man is also introduced. Mrs. Worldly, Mr. Norman. A mother introducing a man to her daughter would say, "Mr. Eminent, my daughter Mary." Or if she is married, "My daughter Mary Smartlington." The reason why it is discourteous, as well as in very bad taste, to speak of one's husband as Mr. Smith or one's daughter as Miss Smith, is that it seems to put the person spoken to into the position of one's social inferior. The same type of rudeness as signing a letter Mrs. Smith without any parentheses. But if one's daughter has a different name, the name can be said with a pause between them makes parentheses. My daughter pause, and then Mrs. Smartlington. My sister, Mrs. Lake. Although the name of a stranger or of the older, more notable person is properly said first, this is no longer considered of importance, except that a woman's name should be said before that of a man, unless the preposition to is prefixed to the lady's name. For instance, to make this polite by adding, "May I introduce you to Mrs. Smith?" Or with greater friendliness, "Mr. Norman, I should like to introduce you to Mrs. Smith." Formerly a man introduces another man to his wife. "Mr. Brown, may I present you to my wife?" Or if this seems to you to imply that you are asking Mr. Brown's permission to present him to your wife, you can say, "Mr. Brown, I should like to introduce you to my wife." A lady introduces her husband to a friend as John and to acquaintances as "my husband." The two names of safety are "my husband" and "my wife." Since they are proper no matter whether you are talking to an archbishop or a climber whom you particularly dislike. The taboo of Mr. and Mrs. is purely social. In business, Mr. Brown and Mrs. Brown are quite correct. To an old friend, a husband would say, "Jim, I want you to meet my wife, on no account the wife." Then he adds, as though in parentheses, "Jim Byer" or "Mr. Byer." Or if they are all very young, he probably says, "Mary, this is Bob Ace," since he is really introducing his friend, not Mrs. Jones, but to Mary. It might be emphasized that an introduction prefaced by the phrase "this is," when said with an enthusiastic inflection, can express a warmth and charm that other introductions lack. This was once illustrated in a London Punch in the drawing of a small boy approaching his mother and holding an abashed small girl by the hand, radiantly exclaiming, "Mummy, this is her." In the same way, a child would introduce a beloved teacher enthusiastically, "Mother, this is Miss Brown." Or on the other hand, to exclaim, "Miss Brown, this is my mother." In the sense of, "Behold, this is my mother. This is she, my mother." has an affectionate emphasis when affectionately said that other introductions lack other forms of introduction. There are many other forms of introduction which might be called conversational introductions, such as Mrs. Jones, do you know Mrs. Norman? Or Mrs. Jones, you know Mrs. Robinson, don't you? On no account, you say, do you not? Best taste always prefers, don't you? Or one may say, Mrs. Robinson, have you met Mrs. Jones? Or to attract our attention, Mary, you have met Mrs. Jones, haven't you? Mrs. Town, Mary's name. These are all good forms, whether gentlemen are introduced to ladies, ladies to ladies, or gentlemen to gentlemen. In introducing gentlemen to a lady, you may ask Mr. Smith if he has met Mrs. Jones, but you must not ask Mrs. Jones if she has met Mr. Smith. It makes not the least difference whether those introduced happen to be married or single. A married man is introduced to a single girl. A young married woman is introduced to an old spinster. Introducing relatives-in-law. A lady introduces her son's wife formally to acquaintances as my daughter-in-law, or to friends as Dick's wife, or with greater display of affection, this is my Mary, Dick's wife. But this would be said only to an old friend. To an acquaintance, my daughter-in-law would depend for its warmth on the tone in which it is said, and this, as already noted in a foregoing paragraph, is of course a very important point in all introductions. By tone alone, the same words can convey every shade of feeling, from cool indifference to adoration. If you are the daughter-in-law, you in turn introduce your mother-in-law as my husband's mother, or my mother-in-law, or in less formal communities you perhaps say, Mother Green, this is Aunt Susie, or the other way about. When introducing other relatives-in-law, my husband's sisters and my brother John's wife, or Jim's sister and John's wife, to one who knows who they are, these names are more clearly understood than my sister-in-law, but this does not matter unless the person to whom they are introduced cares about your husband's family or your brother John. Although they are not really your relatives-in-law, it is quite proper to speak of your husband, of the husband of your sister-in-law as my brother-in-law, and the wife of your brother-in-law as my sister-in-law. Forms of introduction to avoid: do not say, Mr. Jones, shake hands with Mr. Smith, or Mrs. Jones, I want to make you acquainted with Mrs. Smith. Never say, make you acquainted with. And do not, in introducing one person to another, call one of them my friend. You can say my aunt, or my sister, or my cousin, but to pick out a particular person as my friend is bad manners, for it implies that the other person is not. If you are introducing someone to another who is a very special friend, you may say, Mrs. Smith, I want you to meet Mrs. Jones, but you should never say, Mrs. Smith, meet Mrs. Jones. Do not repeat, Mrs. Jones, Mrs. Smith, Mrs. Smith, Mrs. Jones. To say each name once is quite enough, unless it is a foreign one that is difficult to pronounce. Saying this a second time and slowly is not only helpful, but gives one who could not remember a chance to ask later on, will you tell me again how to pronounce your name? Most people very much dislike being asked their names. To say what is your name is always abrupt and unflattering. If you want to know with whom you've been talking, you can generally find either in person later and ask, who was that lady with the gray feather in her hat? The next time you see her, you can say, how do you do, Mrs., and then call her by her name. Titleless youth, in no way to be compared with the bad taste of total strangers. Using first names in introductions on certain radio quiz programs is the younger generation's practice of introducing all friends by first name. Muriel Manners, for example, taking a friend to the country club, greets a group of friends with, hello, everybody. This is Sally. In the modern, fashionable world, the title Mr., Mrs., and Miss are literally never said except to member of a certain group, she is at once called Sarah, or Sally, or quite likely Sal, to be called Miss Stranger, or Mrs. Stranger if she's in the early 20s and announces that she is not a member of the group. Maybe she does not care to join it, maybe they don't want her, but whatever the reason, she does not belong. Obviously, then, introductions among our younger groups are titleless. Sally Stranger and Lucy and Bob Gilding. Or Lucy, this is Sally Stranger, and then to Sally, that is Bob Gilding, and that is Tom Brown. But even so, a man is always introduced to a girl. Also, if Muriel were not really a friend of Sarah Stranger, she would introduce her and her own friends as well by their titles of Mrs., Miss, or Mr., as formally as her mother would. The stranger, by the way, must wait to be called by her first name before calling others by theirs. If you are a younger person, you should never call an older person by her or his first name, unless you are asked to. Whether older people choose to have those who are a generation younger call them by their first name is a question for them to decide. But it is safe to keep in mind that age attempting to masquerade as youth is, to youth itself, inevitably an object of scorn. Young woman to man at dinner. When a young woman finds herself next to an unknown man at a dinner party, she is more likely than not to merely talks to him without telling him her name. But if he introduces himself to her, she perhaps says it in turn. I'm one of the Smiths that live on X Street. She can't very well say I'm Miss Smith, unless she is at least approaching mid-30s. She might not want him to call her Mary, which he would be quite likely to do, were she to say, I'm Mary Smith. It is, of course, an unbreakable rule that all people will find themselves seated together at a table must talk. To sit side by side without speaking is one of the greatest discourtesies a guest can show a hostess. Under all informal circumstances, the roof of a friend serves as an introduction, but at a very large party, such as a dance or a formal tea or wedding reception, it is not customary to speak with those whom you don't know, unless you and another guest find yourselves apart from the others. In such a case, you do not introduce yourself, but you perhaps make a casual remark about the beauty of the bride, or a comment upon the weather. Whether to talk or not usually depends upon mutual willingness, except as already noted with those sitting on either side of you at lunch or dinner, to whom you must talk first to one and then to the other throughout the meal. Under all possible circumstances, what to say when introduced. Under all possible circumstances, the reply to an introduction is, how do you do? It may be said gladly, casually, coolly, or unthinkingly, as the case may be, and it may be varied in pronunciation, emphasis. How do you do? How do you do? How do you do? How do you do? It doesn't sound limited, but so is holding one's knife and fork, and so is drinking coffee after meals. And one can often say nothing at all, just smile. True, the same smile can become equally monotonous at all events. When Mr. Bachelor says, Mrs. Worldly, may I present Mr. Struthers? Mrs. Worldly says, how do you do? Struthers bows and says nothing, to sweetly echo Mr. Struthers with a rising inflection on theirs. Is not good form. Saccharine chirpings should be classed with crooked little fingers. High handshaking and other affections. All affections are bad form. Persons of distinction do not say, charmed or pleased to meet you, when it is actually true. You can say, I'm very glad to meet you, but you may never say, I'm pleased to make your acquaintance. Make your acquaintance is a bad phrase. The taboo of taboos was pleased to meet you. In the last few years, it has almost died out. On an occasion when you meet someone whom you have heard much about and long wanted to meet, you may say, of course say, "Oh, I am so glad to meet you," when a young girl is introduced to another who is the friend of an intimate friend of her own. She naturally explains, "Mary has so often talked about you. A girl should say less than this to a boy. She should not tell him how much Mary has talked about him. A boy, on the other hand, may properly tell a girl that his roommate is always talking about how wonderful she is. Often the first remark is the beginning of a conversation. Sydney Struthers is introduced to Muriel Manners. She smiles and perhaps says, "Tommy tells me you are going to be in New York all winter." Struthers answers, "Yes, I am an intern at the medical center." The one occasion when something more than "how do you do" is necessary is when a friend brings a stranger to your house and tells you, "I have brought Mrs. Blank, who is visiting us." You reply, "I'm so glad you did." Then to the stranger, "I'm delighted to see you, Mrs. Blank." When to shake hands. When gentlemen are introduced to each other, they always shake hands. When a gentleman is introduced to a lady, she generally smiles, bows slightly, and says, "How do you do?" Strictly speaking, it is her place to offer her hand or not, as she chooses. But if he puts out his hand, she of course gives him hers. Nothing could be more ill-bred than to treat any spontaneous friendliness curtly. Those who have been drawn into a conversation do not usually shake hands on parting, but there is no fixed rule. One is more likely to shake hands with someone whom one finds sympathetic than with one who is the contrary. Nearly all rules of etiquette are elastic, and none more so than those governing the acceptance or rejection of the strangers you meet. There is a wide distance between rudeness and reserve. You can be courteously polite and at the same time reserved to someone who does not appeal to you. Or you can be welcomingly friendly to another whom you like on sight. Individual temperament should also be taken into consideration. One person is naturally austere, another genial. The latter shakes hands far more often than the former. At times a few words of explanation make the introduction of a stranger smoothly pleasant. Mrs. Worldly, Mrs. Jenkins. Her pen name is Grace Gotham, or Mr. Neighbor. "I should like you to meet Mr. Dusting. He has just returned from Egypt, where he's been searching for burial pharaohs." This can be very much overdone, and the hostess who habitually exploits her friends as though she were the barker at a sideshow is a bore no less than a pest. On formal occasions, the hostess always stands at the door and the host nearby. Both shake hands with every arrival. On informal occasions, they both rise and go forward to greet each guest, a man as well as a woman, but not necessarily a child. The children in the family should rise to receive another child, as well as rise for every grown person who enters the room and stand until the older person is seated. Grown as well as half-grown members of the family rise to greet guests, but do not necessarily shake hands. A woman guest does not stand when introduced to someone at a distance, nor when shaking hands with a friend of her own or with anyone unless very much older. Should an old lady enter the room in which many other ladies are seated, the others only, unless members of the family who live in the house, do not rise, since 7 or 8 all getting up at once would produce an effect not so much of politeness as of confusion. But every gentleman stands as long as his hostess or any other lady does. How a visitor takes leave. When a visitor is ready to leave, she or he merely stands. To one with whom she has been talking, the visitor says, "Goodbye. I hope I shall see you again soon or sometime," or "I've enjoyed our talk so much." Naturally, a woman is less effusive in what she says to a man than in what she says to another woman, and yet she may very well exclaim, "I've been completely thrilled," if he has told her anything that can be truthfully described as thrilling, but not otherwise. Furthermore, any comment in praise of his opinion or of his achievement or of any especial work he has done is proper, but any remark flattering to his personal appearance or charm would be in person makes, the other person answers, "Thank you." The one who told of his adventures perhaps answers, "I think you've been very good to listen to me," or a woman replies to another who hopes to see her again, "I hope so too. I usually, thank you is all that is necessary." In taking leave of a group of strangers, it makes no difference whether you have been introduced or merely included in their conversation. You bow goodbye to any who happen to be looking at you, but you do not attempt to attract the attention of those who are unaware that you are turning away. On formal occasion, one person to a group. On formal occasions, when a great many people are present, one person is not introduced to each and every member of the group, and an arrival may be introduced to one or two people, or he may be left to talk with those nearby without exchanging names. But at a small lunch, for instance, let us suppose you are the hostess. Your position is not necessarily near, but it is toward the door. Mrs. King is sitting quite close to you, and also Mrs. Lawrence. Mrs. Robinson and Mrs. Brown are much further away. Mrs. Jones enters. You go a few steps forward and shake hands with her, and then stand aside, as it were, to see whether Mrs. Jones goes to speak to anyone. If she apparently knows no one, you say, "Mrs. King." Mrs. Jones. Mrs. King, if she is young, rises, shakes hands with Mrs. Jones, and sits down. If Mrs. King is about the same age as Mrs. Jones, Mrs. King merely extends her hand and does not rise. Having said Mrs. Jones once, you do not repeat it immediately, but turning to the other lady sitting near you, you say, "Mrs. Lawrence." You can, if you choose, look across the room and continue. Mrs. Robinson, Mrs. Brown, Mrs. Jones. The two bow, but do not rise. It is much more practical to repeat the names of those present for that of the new arrival, because the attention of each is attracted by hearing her own name, whereas the one entering is naturally paying attention. At a very big lunch, you would introduce Mrs. Jones to Mrs. King, and possibly Mrs. Lawrence, so that Mrs. Jones might have someone to talk to. But if other guests come in at this moment, Mrs. Jones finds a place for herself, and after all a pause, falls naturally into conversation with those she is next to, without giving her name or asking theirs. Typically, of many American communities, the practice of the hostess who takes each arriving guest, especially typical of many American communities, is the practice of the hostess who takes each arriving guest, especially a stranger, up to every other guest at a large party. This is a kind of procedure, but one likely to fail of its friendly intent, because after hostess and guest have made a grand circuit of the room, new arrivals claim the hostess, and the guest is left with no one. It is really better for a hostess to seat a stranger and introduce her to those nearby. At a small party, 5 or 6 strangers usually introduced to everyone in turn, but if not, people always talk with those seated near them in the house of a friend. It would be a breach of etiquette not to. When to introduce, the question as to when introductions should be made or not made is one of the most elusive points of social knowledge. One occasion that requires introductions is the presentation of everyone to a guest of honor. If one arrives after receiving line has ended, he must look for his guest and present himself, since it is the height of rudeness to go to an entertainment given in honor of someone and fail to meet him, even though one's memory is too feeble to remember him afterward. At a dance, when an invitation has been asked for a stranger, the friend who vouched for him should personally present him to the hostess. Mrs. Worldly, this is Mr. Robinson, or if he is young, John, whom you said I might bring. The hostess shakes hands and smiles and says, "I am very glad to see you, Mr. Robinson." A guest in a box at the opera or horse show or county fair introduces her hostess. Any gentleman gentleman who comes to speak to her unless other people block the distance between so that an introduction would be forced and awkward. At a formal dinner, a dinner of ceremony, the host should see that every gentleman either knows or is presented to the lady he is to take in to dinner, and also, if possible, to the one who is to sit at the other side of him. If the latter introduction is overlooked, people sitting next to each other at table introduce themselves. A gentleman says, "I am Arthur Robinson," or showing her his place card, "This is my name." Or the lady says first, "I am Mrs. Hunter Jones," and the man says, "My name is Titherington Smith." In any case, those seated together are obliged to talk. For beginning a conversation, see index. Should you take a friend visiting you to the house of another friend, it is always safer to introduce your visitor to those whom you encounter than to expect a hostess to remember a guest's name. When not to introduce a newly arriving visitor in a lady's drawing room is not introduced to another who is taking leave, nor is an animated conversation between two persons interrupted to introduce a third. You must never introduce people to each other in public places if you have no reason to doubt that the introduction will be agreeable to both. You cannot commit a greater blunder than to introduce to a notable person someone she does not care to know, especially on shipboard, in hotels, or in other very small, rather public communities where people are so closely thrown together that it is correspondingly difficult to avoid presuming acquaintances who have been the wedge of an introduction. When two people, either friends or acquaintances, are walking together, and they meet a third who stops to speak to one of them, the other walks on and slowly on and does not stand awkwardly by and wait for an introduction. If the third is asked by the one who she knows to join them, the sauntering friend is overtaken and an introduction made. The third, however, must not join the others unless invited to do so, like vampires. At a very large dinner, people are not collectively introduced. After dinner, men in the smoking room are left at table. Always talk to their neighbors whether they have been introduced or not, and ladies in the drawing room do the same. Quaint writers on etiquette speak of correct introductions that carry obligations of future acquaintances, and incorrect introductions that seemingly obligate one to nothing. Degrees of introduction are utterly unknown to best society. One person is welcomed by those he comes in contact with because he happens to be clever or sympathetic or attractive. Another is rejected by those who find him antipathetic or boring. Introductions can no more detract from the charm of the one they can add to the unacceptability of the other. Conversation without introduction. On occasions it happens that in talking to one person you want to include another in your conversation without making an introduction. For instance, suppose you are talking to a seedsman and a friend joins you in their garden. You greet your friend and then include her by saying, "Mr. Smith is suggesting that I dig up these cannas and put in delphiniums." Whether your friend gives an opinion about the changing color of your flower bed or not, she has been made part of your conversation. Halfway introduction of domestic employee. Ordinarily, the introduction of a maid or a butler or a chauffeur or any domestic employees to a guest would be as out of place as introducing the driver of a bus to the passengers. But there are many occasions when, for one reason or another, a halfway introduction is made. For example, Mrs. Kindheart having offered the use of her car to Celia, for example. Celia Lovejoy says, as the chauffeur opens the door at her own house, "Carlson, take Mrs. Lovejoy wherever she wants to go this afternoon, and that will be all for today." Or, for example, to a house guest, as the maid who is to unpack the visitor's clothes approaches, "Will you give Selma the keys to your bags?" Or to a man, "If you ring 4 times, Dawson will look after you." A real introduction is made only when the servant has been long in the family and is held in affectionate esteem. In the South, certainly, and very likely elsewhere, a young man would tell his fiancée, "Muriel, this is my addressing someone, it is quite proper to introduce yourself. For instance, you would say, Mrs. Worldly, are you a friend of my mother's? I am Mrs. Titherington, Smith's daughter. Mrs. Worldly says, yes, indeed, I am. I'm so glad you spoke to me. But if a strange man says, aren't you Muriel Manners? Muriel says yes and waits for his explanation. And then if the stranger continues, I think my sister Millicent Brown is a friend of yours. Muriel at once offers her hand and smiling asks, are you George or Alec? I'm Alec. Whereupon Muriel probably says, hello, Alec. But unless he is the brother of her friend or a particular friend of a friend, a man should say, are you Miss Manners? I'm Arthur Jones. I met you at dinner, Mrs. Worldly's last winter. Whereupon Muriel would greet him with the inevitable, how do you do, Mr. Jones? Or if she's willing to be called Muriel, she says, hello, Arthur. In spite of this titleless custom of the younger generation, certain conventions prevail. It would be in very bad taste to introduce yourself to Mrs. Worldly if your mother knew her only slightly, or for any man without credentials to introduce himself to Muriel, and more especially to think of calling her Muriel. The retort, courteous to one forgotten. Suppose someone you have forgotten says, you don't remember me, do you? Since